Good evening. You're listening to this week's edition of Inside Eyewitness News. I'm Crystal Alderson. Now, this week, Cape Town was once again appeared at the top of a greatest city on earth list. It fought off stiff competition from the likes of Venice, Dubai, and London to secure a place in the top 3. But while the ranking is great news for tourism, the reality for the majority of people who call the city home, it's a world away from Table Mountain, the blue flag beaches, the 5-star hotels, and the Michelin-starred restaurants. And while the city is the ideal playground for visitors, how does the ranking reconcile with the lives of ordinary Cape Townians? Now, this week alone, as we earlier reported, that Shamila Fisher told us about the mass shootings that took place and how communities are living in fear. Tonight, we ask the question, if Cape Town is really one of the best cities to live in, what does it really mean for ordinary people? And then more broadly, how do we make our cities in South Africa more livable for all? Now, tonight I'm joined by Aldred de Klerk, Principal Associate at the African Centre for Security and Intelligence Praxis, who also lived in countries such as Sri Lanka, Amsterdam and Cape Town. And I know, Aldred, you call Bo-Kaap home. We're also joined by Danga Mughogho, Programs Manager at Well-Governed Cities, based in Johannesburg, but who's also lived in different African cities. And then lastly, we're joined by Enver Dumini, Cape Town Tourism CEO, who would I say is a proudly Cape Townian. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Thank you. So our phone lines, of course, are open on 011-883-0702 if you are in Johannesburg, or 021-446-0567 if you are in Cape Town. We'll also be taking your calls between now and 9. You can also leave us a voice note or message us on our WhatsApp number 077021702. Good evening, gentlemen. Now, I'll start off with you, Enver. Of course, it's a great accolade for Cape Town to get this, and I won't take it away as I'm a born and bred Cape Townian now here in Johannesburg, so congratulations. But Enver, as someone that's, you've grown up in Cape Town, you're a proud young man from the Cape Flats. What does this accolade really mean for people in Khayelitsha, in Bonteheuwel, but of course also Camps Bay?
So good evening, Crystal. I mean, as a Cape Townian and as someone in tourism, being recognized as a great city is always something that we need to acknowledge because it's somebody else saying we've gone through a process and we acknowledge this is kind of how we rank you against other competitor cities. But you're right, we are still almost like a tale of two cities. And there's a lot of issues that we still have as a city that needs to be addressed seriously. But I also think to a large extent is, what this accolade also means for tourism is for tourism practitioners in Khayelitsha, in Gugulethu, in Mitchell's Plain, that are also welcoming this because I think, again, the city is made up of different neighborhoods, of different experiences, more than just the CBD than Camps Bay, even though that is always something that gets recognized a lot easier globally. But I think for us as Cape Town Tourism specifically, our focus has been on saying how do we drive a lot more tourism to the communities. And we started seeing that happen over the last 2-3 years specifically, as because of COVID. So I think, again, it is always good to acknowledge the fact that we get this accolade. But as tourism, we're also not oblivious to the fact that, the city itself is still divided spatially, and that there's still economic problems, poverty, crime, etc. So we also believe that tourism also becomes almost a mechanism to hopefully start addressing some of those issues by trying to create employment for the unemployed, that hopefully gets people out of poverty.
Thanks, Enver. Now, Danga, of course, you work for SA Cities Network. You released such an insightful report about the state of our cities. And as you heard from Enver talking very realistically that it is a tale of two cities, spatially still divided. What's your thoughts, Danga?
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you for having me on the show, and greetings to my fellow panelists. Yes, I mean, I would very much agree with what Enver has said, is that we should, of course, celebrate the fact that Cape Town has achieved this global ranking. Any success for one of our cities is a success for all of us as a country, and so that is definitely something to be proud of, but that doesn't detract from or prevent us from, interrogating that a bit more closely and to say that, well, depending on who the people who did the rankings were talking to, what kinds of things they focused on, the story that they're telling may not be the same one that is experienced by many of Cape Town's residents who may not be in the same income bracket, for example, or doing the same sorts of things that tourists do. I think particularly when we're looking at tourism, I mean, I think the view, of course, is pitched towards people who are outside visitors to a country. So the things that tourists would be interested in doing and seeing, and as Ember says, of course, that could be everything from Clifton and Camps Bay to particular tours in Khayelitsha, for example, but that doesn't necessarily speak to the lived experience of the people who actually live in those places. So it doesn't necessarily speak to the lived experience of people in Camps Bay, just as it doesn't necessarily speak to the lived experiences of people in Khayelitsha.
Yes, Danga, and of course, your report detailed some of those things, some of the challenges that these cities, have to deal with, poor infrastructure, trying to create more productive, inclusive, sustainable and spatially transformed cities. But do you think that, our city managers are, able to do that?
Well, that is a good question, and thank you for pointing out our report, which, as you said, was launched just a couple of weeks ago. We do this every 5 years. It's the State of South African Cities, and it's really a look back at how cities have performed over the previous local government administrative term, and then also looking forward to things that the administration should be thinking about moving forward. And I think it'd be fair to say that in all our cities, and in fact in many of our municipalities, despite the press reports that we see, the vast majority of employees want to do a good job and they want to achieve. And as you say, the city manager is the chief executive officer, if you will, of a municipality, and the people in the municipal city managers' administrations in the main are trying to do their best. But as we point out in our report, and sadly we've pointed it out in reports over the years, is that it's a challenging job. The local government sector is very difficult, and I think one thing is very complex. Just the budget of a city is bigger than that of a national department, and yet when we often hear the news, we're always talking about national departments and so on. But also the space itself is characterized by a lot of regulation, which administrations have to deal with, but also, as we've seen since 2016, increasingly political contestation. So some of the assumptions that were made about having one government in control in all spheres of government is no longer the case. And so particularly in cities where there's been contestation, and this is also to say that contestation can be both between parties but also within them, right? But in cities where there has been that contestation, the political instability has had a negative effect on the administration. So the one thing that you want as an administrator in any country, in any municipality or any government, is you want stability and predictability, and that's what they like.
Okay.
That's what they work best with and allows them to do their jobs.
Aldred, now, you've heard what Danga had to say, what Enver had to say. Now, as a security expert and analyst, having followed your work for years, Aldred, you've worked in conflict zones like Sri Lanka, in Ireland, across the continent, but you also call Cape Town home. And, this week, of course, you had your hands and you were quite busy given the mass kind of shootings we saw in Khayelitsha. Now, in your opinion, how do we make our cities more livable given the reality of our socioeconomic conditions, but also crime?
Good evening, Crystal, and good evening to my fellow panelists and to your listeners. Yes, as my colleagues have said, it's a benign truth to point out that all cities are poor areas and wealthy areas. It's also a benign truth to point out the obvious, and that is that poor people experience a city different to wealthy people. So in the city of Cape Town, deciding whether it's a nice place to live really depends on whether you're rich or poor or middle class. The unfortunate thing about the city of Cape Town is that, and I do call it home, is that we have separate but not necessarily equal development happening in the city. How the city of Cape Town spends its budget and where it places the emphasis of that budget is something that we have to interrogate. There's also a question of the kind of governance that the city is guilty of, which is a neoliberal government that focuses on privatization, small government, making sure that public spaces is almost eroded, and that it tends to peg itself against a sort of market economy. Now we can say that, all economies are going that way, yet that underlines and it in fact belies the constitutional imperative, and that is to serve the poorest of the poor, which is why the Gini coefficient and the divides in the city of Cape Town remains as it is. Let me just say one thing related to, before we really get into the crime and violence thing, is that the criteria used for this accolade is actually a celebration of our constitutional our constitutional values and imperatives. It's got nothing to do with the city. There's also a market in having what we call the green or the pink rand and the green rand, which is why we should be celebrating anthropology and geography, as the survey has done. And who gets to benefit and who access the same tourism that our international visitors go, that's something that the city and our tourism sector has to address. They have to make tourism affordable to the people of Cape Town. The violence and crime aspects of that is that if we don't start spending the budget of the city, and Danga has told us how big the budget of the city is, and he's also mentioned the contestation between provincial, local and national government, and that's a contestation that has to come to an end. It benefits nobody. We have to start spending the budget of the city to address the social, economic and political malaise in which crime continues to thrive in the city of Cape Town, and which is one of the most violent cities in the world.
But Aldred, one can say, both of us have traveled all over the world. One could argue the same about Rio in Brazil. Absolutely. Or, Nairobi in Kenya, that, crime is the reality of major cities. And for instance, in the SA network, the cities report, we, for instance, it says that, firstly, South Africans are moving to cities. South Africa's population is projected to grow by an additional 19 to 24 million people, most of whom will be living in cities and towns. Now, I know that you've been you work with community policing forums, you work with communities across South Africa. Municipalities are, you're quite critical about their budgets and how they actually then redistribute. But, are we ever going to live in safer cities? Can I, as a woman, walk out at night? Because, Aldred, the reality is, having lived in a city like Dakar in Senegal, which is also, not a rich city, as a woman, I can walk out at midnight and feel completely safe. That's not the reality in Cape Town or any other city in South Africa.
Well, thank you for making those examples, because we have to say that poverty doesn't cause crime and that poor people are not necessarily the ones who commit crime. So let's just take that off the table. What then is the reality of the lives of people of Cape Town? And I was pointing to this neoliberal logic that informs the management of public services in the city of Cape Town. And that is actually dethroned and eroded honest political practices of where those of us affected by decisions are recognized in both the making of those decisions and the implementation of those decisions. The people of the city of Cape Town, as in much of the other municipalities, we've been relegated to consumer and to passive recipients of services and to subjects rather than citizens. So we need to pick up on the narrative that the president is pushing, and that is of good public governance, that the public servants who serve the city of Cape Town and all our cities need to understand that it's a hard conversation that they need to have with yourselves as the fourth estate and every single street and household in the city. Because as much as we erode governance and decisions are made devoid of us, devoid of our needs, our vulnerabilities and our interests, and it's aggregated to a city council, to councillors and to a management who's not beholden or accountable to us as citizens, not subjects, not consumers, but as citizens, we will not start to address the issues that affect the city, because the wisdom and the solutions lie with a very difficult conversation that has to be had between a neoliberal city and city management and the constitution and the people of the city of Cape Town. And that's the conversation that's not been had.
Enver, so as you know, the principal officer of tourism CEO, you straddle these different lines. Like, you obviously have to answer to politicians. You also have to answer to the city managers. You know, how do you navigate the space given what we've heard from Danga and Aldred around, you know, kind of the spatial divides, but also the kind of neoliberal policies that our cities often adopt at the expense of the majority of those that live in it?
So, Crystal, I think maybe just for a point of clarity, as Cape Town Tourism, we're actually not a city entity at all. We are actually a not-for-profit, an independent not-for-profit industry association who just happens to do the marketing for the city through an agreement. So we don't report to politicians, but what we do is that we do report to government, the officials, through formalized reporting on the spend, on the projects and the programs we do. So I think from a Cape Town tourism perspective, I mean, for us, our independence and political independence is quite critical, especially if what we do is saying, how do we actually utilize tourism as a vehicle to address poverty, to address some of the issues we have around crime, etc. And some of the programs that we do have as Cape Town Tourism speaks to that. It's not just about destination marketing. This is also about destination management. So things we do in communities, things we do with schools, in getting to see the value in tourism, and not just poverty porn where we put people onto buses and send them into townships. That's how tourism used to be sold. What we actually believe in saying is that we actually create programs and work with communities so they can understand how they can benefit directly from tourism and through tourism, and that they can build their hotels like Spade in Khayelitsha. There's food and wine experiences in Khayelitsha, not where we keep saying, if you want a food and wine experience, then you need to take people out of Khayelitsha or Langa, Gugule to Mitchell's Plain. And this is kind of where we sit as an industry association saying, tourism is actually probably one of the best vehicles we can use. And when you look at poverty across the world, tourism has the ability to is accessible to everybody because the barriers to entry, whether you've got a taxi driver who's got a vehicle, can become a tour operator. If somebody's got a B&B or a house and they've got a room, they can become accommodation provider. So I think for us is that understanding the value of tourism and getting more support for tourism actually can start addressing some of the opportunities for jobs to start alleviating people out of poverty. And I think for us, that is the clear driver from our side, whether they are neoliberal or whether they have got other politics. For us, it's about what is the right thing to do so that we can address what we have and the challenge we have in our city through tourism.
So, Enver, Cape Town is, of course, your primary job, but when you do go to international expos, you also talk about South Africa, and we know the kind of broader socioeconomic, realities. I mean, I do recall when, for instance, Shreen Divani, when his wife Annie was killed, and I still covered it as a report in Cape Town, and it was, in Googs near to Mzoli's. I remember the kind of international outcry and just the kind of, the Telegraph, that's now named as the third greatest city on earth, was the one that had like anti kind of Cape Town and South Africa sentiments, So how do you navigate that yes, you have a city to market, but you also, market South Africa as a destination for, people who want to come to Africa?
So I'll be honest here, it's exceptionally difficult, especially in the day and age that we are today. I think back then, 10 years, World Cup time, 12 years ago, you had traditional media, had radio, television, maybe a little bit of internet. But I think where social media is today is to counteract negative media is always difficult. Our job, and we did a calculation some time back where for every negative piece out there, you need to counter that with at least 9 positive pieces about the destination. So it is an uphill battle, and I think to a large extent, that's why when we receive accolades, we are not oblivious to the fact that, this is not really a pat in the back and saying job well done. It's just saying we acknowledge what you're doing and we recognize some of the good that you have in a destination. And if we can harness a lot of that good and starting to convince others that we're not just a negative media destination, then hopefully people will come and visit, spend their euros, spend their dollars, spend their rands, so that we can start keeping people employed, especially after the last 2 years of COVID, where we've lost about 40% of the jobs in tourism in Cape Town alone.
So, Danga, I want to come back to you now. A recent report released by Statista in March, entitled "Most Expensive Cities to Live in Africa," who compared the cost of living in different African cities. So, for instance, Dakar in Senegal was listed as the most expensive city to live in Africa, followed by Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Morocco and South Africa, of course, had multiple cities listed on the report: Johannesburg, Cape Town, Pretoria, and Durban. Now, if we look at the cost of living to live in these cities, spatial apartheid, which is, of course, a legacy in our cities. How do we, in your opinion, start unraveling this and actually create inclusive cities for all?
Thanks, Crystal. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned that because as part of those two cities that you mentioned, actually, Senegal, Dakar, and Addis Ababa, and in contrast to cities in Southern Africa and indeed in South Africa, developed organically. So you actually have pockets of rich people living next to pockets of poor people. It's not sort of planned in the way that our cities are, and very much cities in Southern Africa, which is where you have, a city center and then workers are far away, and it's a car-centric models and so on. But clearly, what you would want to have in cities is, and what we advocate for is, effective public transport, and effective and cheap and affordable to the vast majority of citizens. So that transport should be able to bring citizens from their homes to their place of work, and it should not take a significant chunk out of their budgets. I think some of the negotiations, I was listening to the radio earlier today about arguing that the night shift, because of the shifts they work, they're asking for an additional allowance just because the simple cost of just getting to and from work is so great. Of course, then here in South Africa, we had apartheid, which created even greater spatial dislocation for workers. And so we've always advocated for bringing citizens into the city, for densifying, because a density is where you can get the benefits of, you need certain density. So your trains, for example, aren't empty off-peak hours, and your buses are full throughout the day. So these are things that, happen slowly. Of course, the cities are already built up, and in many ways we call this spatial transformation, but that would be the goal of what we want to see. But also a city that's safe and inclusive. So inclusivity and some of the crime statistics we've been talking about, you're mentioning about being a woman living in a city, inclusion also means safety. And so not only do we include the vulnerable in terms of economic opportunities, but we also include the vulnerable from a safety perspective. So we're speaking about children, women, and people with disabilities, elderly people as well. So I think inclusion very much goes with this idea of making a city affordable, accessible, and safe for everybody.
Aldred, now you've lived in different cities all over the world. What can we do to just, the little things we can do to make our cities safer?
Well, I think Danga highlighted two things. One is the cost of public transport and the absence of public transport. And let's be very clear, as much as we celebrate the contribution made by somebody who has a minibus taxi, that's not public transport, because that person is not accountable to me. They're providing a public service under license from the Department of Transport. They're accountable only to themselves and the Department of Transport and the provisions of their license. So we need affordable public transport that's omnipresent and is reliable and is safe. That's the first thing. Then the second thing is we do need to look at how any city, whether it's Cape Town or else, are using public spaces and public land. Then we need to look at issues of mixed modal housing development. We do need to be able to afford the poor, not just coming into the city and providing a cheap workforce and then leaving the city and spending 40 to 60% of the income getting to and from work, but they should be living as close to work as possible. And this is where the private sector and the city on its focus on privatization and free trade needs to become part of the conversation, because they need to accept their responsibility in ensuring that somebody who works for a major retailer doesn't work at the furthest retailer from where they are, because of this dated notion that if they work too close to home, they're too familiar with the local people, and they might be inclined to provide favors and special services to those who are close to them. We really have to have that hard conversation to say the private sector has a role to play, government has a role to play, and we've seen with tourism, as much as I celebrate its contribution, it's a very fickle thing. Next year, another city will get the same accolade and people will go there. We need to ensure that manufacturing starts to come up, that we get our commodities as locally sourced as possible. This city used to be known for the garment workers, that was the biggest union at the start of COSATU. We used to be in the fishing industry, so we need to make sure that our local fishermen start to work. We used to be in construction. The 2010 World Cup, the same thing that Emma was talking about, we didn't even have local artisans to work on there. So there's a lot we can do to put people to work that is not dependent on the fickleness of a tourist sector, where somebody may or may not decide to come. And Cape Town is a very far destination to come to. Local and domestic tourism is where the emphasis should be lying, and is also putting our people to work so that the quality of people's lives can be affected. Not just a job, but a job that pays a living wage and it changes the quality of your life, and you're living and working as close to work as possible.
Enver, so in your opinion, I mean, I know that you do a lot. I mean, if like just Cape Town, there's, the graffiti tour, there's the Gatsby tour, local delicacies, that you're really trying to get people, to see the full diversity of Cape Town, but also, the entire province and then hopefully the entire country. But, realistically, I mean, given all the challenges that we have, and what Aldred mentioned, for instance, affordable transport, we know that, the main train line, stops right in Langa. Well, it starts in Langa and then goes to the city. So a whole, thousands of people simply don't have access. I mean, how do you navigate this? Because, I mean, I'm certainly sure, Enver, being from Cape Town, seeing the full spectrum of the entire, Cape Flats, etc., that you have to navigate these inequalities, but also navigate putting on this kind of showcase to the world of, this international global city. Enver?
I can hear me now?
Oh, yes. We seem to have lost you there for a few minutes. Did you hear my question?
I did, thank you, yeah. So it's exceptionally difficult to navigate, but we have to navigate nonetheless. And I think to what Aldred has indicated is, there are many things that the city can reclaim. That was its forte, but I think also other things that it's beginning to reclaim is the BPO sector, in other words, call centers. I think we're probably one of the most prolific on the continent and creating jobs and employment in areas like Mitchell's Plain, where we're seeing, these call centers now beginning to pop up more than just in the CBD. Also, if you're looking at the clothing sector, Clotex now, and the city themselves also focusing on saying, guys, we need to bring back that skills and manufacturing, etc. So they are coming along, but I think we also need to be prepared for the fourth industrial revolution, where the skill set of what we could utilize in the city could be to an advantage. And again, I think this is the part of, from what I can recall, is part of the city's initiative. But on the tourism side, it is exceptionally difficult to navigate. But we have to do it, because the one thing we find is that tourists want to hang out where the locals hang out. They want to experience local culture. And I think that from Constantia, etc. And we create a route. We start connecting food and wine, and using that, start changing the narrative that, a township can't connect with a wine from, why not? We've also seen Kailicha wines coming through now, again, as a manifestation of what is possible. So I think for us is that we've got amazing experiences all over Cape Town, not just in the traditional tourism spots. Those are still beautiful, and from a marketing perspective, you need that in order to hook the traditional tourist and how travel trade still sells an destination. So what we're working exceptionally hard at is to get people to go off the beaten track, off the beauty aspect of the geography and see the beauty in its people. And that is something that we are clear on.
Trust. I'm Crystal Alderson, and you're listening to Inside Eyewitness News. This evening, we're discussing and debating what needs to happen to ensure that our cities are livable for all. And this week, of course, Cape Town was voted the third best city to live in the world. Now, interestingly enough, it's the Telegraph, the UK's Telegraph, that released the list. What's interesting, if you look at the top 50, there's cities that, for instance, number 8 is London, number 12, Paris, 33 Mexico City, 34 New Orleans, 46 is New Delhi. We've also got Amsterdam, Edinburgh, Berlin, on the list. And I've visited some of these cities, and I think I recall in San Francisco is also on the list. I've never seen so many homeless people, or, some parts of London, I think is, quite pretty, it's not safe for women, or I think even some parts of Paris or, New Orleans or Mexico City, but back to, the discussion tonight, and I'm asking, we've set the framework of, what's wrong with our cities, but for me now, for the next 20 minutes, at least until 9, I want to, get a sense from our panelist, which of course is Aldred de Klerk, Principal Associate at the African Center for Security and Intelligence Praxis, has lived all over the world, and he calls Cape Town home. We also have Danga Mughogho, who works at SA Cities Network, and they bring out this, absolutely interesting and I think a must read for any urban developer or someone who's interested in understanding our cities. And then lastly, we've got Enver Dumini, Cape Town Tourism CEO, who's of course from this conversation very committed to building an inclusive city and a tourist city for, those with money and even those without money. So gentlemen, thanks for joining me tonight. I want to, we've set the scene. I want to now, have a discussion around, some way forward. So, Danga, I'll start with you. How do we tackle the different challenges in our cities to ensure that it's, livable for all? And here I'm talking about South African cities like Durban, like Johannesburg, Cape Town, Gqeberha, other cities in other parts of the country.
Thanks, Crystal. I think the beginnings of an answer to that actually come out of our report, which specifically focused on governance for the very reason that we said, we keep pointing out these same issues around inclusion, around productivity, around well-being in our cities, and, what is the catalyst rather that would change things. And so we really chose to focus on two elements of governance. So number one is cooperative governance, and the second is an all-of-society approach. By cooperative governance, we mean the relationship between the spheres of government. So, although local government is the core face of development as envisioned in the Local Government White Paper of 1998 and subsequent legislation, and this is where development takes place. I mean, we live locally. Our experience is with our sanitation, our waste, paying for electricity, paying for water. Our lived experience is very much a local one. But we would argue in this report that cooperative governance has not necessarily been as effective as the Constitution envisaged. So we call on national government and provincial government to fully support the local sphere in its efforts to achieve developmental local government and local outcomes. So, for example, we talked about Cape Town being the one city actually in South Africa where you could have said a while ago, many people use the trains. Transport, however, is a provincial function, and the fact that Metro Rail has been allowed to fall to such an extent is a direct problem, and that only province is capacitated to deal with now. So that's an example of some of the other things. We talked about housing. Why were RDP houses built far away from city centres, after 1994? Housing is a provincial function. Local government, it may make sense as a conversation that has been happening for a long time to devolve those functions, housing and transport, to the local sphere because they make more sense, but they should also be funded at the same time. And then just to go to the all-society approach briefly, Enver hinted at this in terms of the engagement with communities in managing destinations. So working with local communities is extremely important. As Eldred was saying, the idea of developmental local government and indeed the integrated urban development framework, which actually is our urban policy since 2016, says that communities should be empowered. It shouldn't be an IDP exercise, and IDP is the development plan for a community, shouldn't be a checkbox exercise where cities go and just say, this is what we've decided you should have. We should hold, and it's about accountability, because when citizens are fully engaged with processes, they should be consulted about what development they would like to see in their area. They should be consulted about what they would like to see happen, and they should then be in a position to hold the local government to account. And I think that relationship has definitely broken down. And I think it's fair to say that, particularly in the Cape, where the UDF was so strong, there was a demobilization of civil society bodies after 1994 that in many ways, took away from that civic mindedness that was so strong across the country, and particularly marked, I think, in parts of the Western Cape. I think also to say that the political instability. I think unfortunately you get the politicians you get in any country, but really to call on politicians to understand that the instability in the political sphere has a direct knock-on effect on political, on administrations. And we found this through our research in the built environment. You'd think, what difference does it make? An engineer just has to fix a pothole or build a bridge or build a road. But the fact of the matter is that the accountability that breaks down as a result of political instability means that engineer is not able to do their job properly, and they find that themselves in a position where they're not able to deliver the basic services that our citizens need in order to do the very basic things, which is A, to live, but B, also to create livelihoods for themselves. And I'll just end on this point, perhaps, which is to say that, and as Eldred was indicating, the economy is so important, and this is where cooperative governance is so important. There are so many critiques that we know about the systemic problems that have not been dealt with in the country that have a knock-on effect on businesses that we're all facing load shedding now, for example. There are regulations which hamper the ability of independent power producers perhaps to ramp up their delivery and so on. So I think that there needs to be a long, hard look, from all spheres of government to say, are we really doing all that we can to support local government, which is the core face of development, to achieve their goals, which are about productivity, inclusion, and well-being of all citizens.
Thanks for that insight, Danga. We've got some listeners who has called in. It's to me, Edward from Johannesburg.
Yes, I'm in the Mulder's Drift area, which is towards the West Rand. Is that Crystal Alderson?
Yes, it is, Edward. Good evening.
Good evening. How are you and your staff? Wonderful show that you run. And good evening to listeners if I am online.
Yes, you are. Thank you, Edward, for calling in. What's your question?
Crystal, I WhatsApped you, and I'm a Food Forward South Africa member. I feed, and I've been feeding the poorest of the poor. And, under the ruling party, corruption is so big. When the lockdown started, the ward councillors took all the food and they sold it. And I'm not going to mention names in this ward, but they sold the food, and I was left alone to feed. I collected food at Pick and Pay. I'm in contact with Andre Null and them down in Cape Town. I then became a Food Forward member, and we are now feeding at least 40 families a week. And when I say 40 families a week, my question is I need more support, because there's probably, with the times going as they are now, the need to feed about 100 families. So that's one question. And the second question is, or the second statement that I want to make is, about 500 million illegals in our country. There's two sides of the coin. The companies that employ them are causing a problem, because obviously they do it for reasons of paying and abusing them as well. Because remember, these people come here, most of them because there's war in their country and instability, okay? Except for Malawi, there's no war there, but they are good people, do you understand? So my question is if there are 500 million plus illegals in our country.
Edward, I have to go in here because it's not 500 million. I think if we had that number, our country would have been overrun by people. But thank you for your question, Edward, and I'll certainly have our panelists answer, very important points that you've mentioned. So thank you very much, Edward. So we'll park that question. I've also got Tumi in Cape Town. Tumi, fire away. Good evening. Thanks for calling in. Can you switch off your radio so that you can ask your question to the panelists? Oh, I think Tumi having some challenges with her line, so we'll leave it at that for now. Tumi, do we have you on air? Good evening. Okay, we seem to not.
Are you speaking to me?
Yes. Hi, good evening.
Yes, ma'am. Crystal, you're speaking to Masamola in Oliver.
Yes, good evening.
Yes, evening to you too and the guests. I like to say I don't know who conducted this research, and I just want to say I vehemently disagree with them. I mean, I'm sure they've got their own reasons why they treated Cape Town as one of top 3 in the world. But if you are a South African and you live here, I mean, even I, who live in the city of Tshwane, far away from Cape Town, I know that Cape Town is not safe. It's problem of drugs, it's problem of crime, unemployment, the divide between the rich and the poor. And Mr. de Klerk, I would like to agree with him when he says that the city is sort of skewed the way it distributes its resources, focused mainly in the so-called white areas. And so, what boggles my mind and the question I'm asking myself is the person who conducted or people who conducted this research, what exactly is their end goal? What are they trying to achieve? Because, I mean, really, we know as South Africans that Cape Town cannot be one of the best 3 in the world. There's definitely no way that can be possible. And so, I would like to totally agree with Mr. de Klerk. Totally agree with you.
Okay, thank you for that question. So, Inva, how do you respond to criticism like we've heard from our listener?
Thanks, Crystal. So I think, at the end of the day, this was the view of, from what we understand, readers of the Telegraph that voted for many cities. So every year, I know they interview and survey about 75,000 readers of the Telegraph, and then they kind of pick cities based on that. But I think to a large extent, a lot of the criteria, etc., was mostly skewed towards tourism. So I think to a large extent, it's through a tourism lens. And Cape Town, I think, for about 7 consecutive years, won the best city or the favorite city of Telegraph readers. So I think there was already a skewing towards it. At the end of the day, this wasn't really scientific. It's a Telegraph interviewing and surveying based on certain sets of criteria. I think the one thing they were clear on was that, as much as we've got the topography, the safe spaces for LGBTQI+, air quality, those are things that they rated along with 5-star hotels, beaches. So I think to a large extent, yes, it was stacked in our favor based on those. But I think where we fell short when they compared us to other cities where our ranking could have improved was safety. And I think that's the thing that we continue to face wherever we go in the world to sell tourism, whether South Africa or Cape Town. Safety is the number one question that we deal with over and over again. Even though there's very little, crimes against tourists themselves, it's the perception of safety and the concern of travelers and trade saying it's an unsafe destination. We don't want to come there because we are fearful of our lives. We are fearful of our clients, etc. And therefore, we have to work double hard by trying to address that. And then what we also do is we actually host travel trade and travel media to come to the destination so they can see it for themselves and write for themselves so that they take an opinion based on their own experience, not purely on only perception. But again, it is a difficult thing that we continue to navigate. But I agree to some extent, like I said before, we are divided cities. There's a lot of things that we need to get right. There were some great suggestions from the other panelists of what we need to do. And I think from a tourism perspective is that we will continue to try and drive the positive messages so that we can, of course, attract as many tourists and visitors so they can experience the city and hopefully retain those jobs that we still have left in the sector.
Now, Aldred, I want to come to you now. So the SA Cities Network report, for instance, mentioned that, South African cities really have the potential to be the reference point for cities across the globe in identifying, experimenting, solutions to the future challenges that cities will face. So in your opinion, Aldred, how do we tackle the different challenges in our cities and what is possible, because South Africa can actually show other cities, what to do?
Well, one of the things is that we credit ourselves for being a city in Africa. So we need to embrace the fact that we're Africans. We need to embrace the colloquial. In other words, we need to understand the value in having our own languages spoken. We need to understand the value of the cultural diversity that we have as South Africans. And we need to embrace the fact that we're going to have increased migration. Not only migration within our cities, but also from outside our country. There's something of value there, and this is where there needs to be a better synergy, and I challenge Enver to do more in terms of saying to local government and to the private sector how, for example, the fact that we keep lamenting the fact that foreigners, so-called foreigners, are being employed in certain sectors. Well, they